Hello, everyone. My name is David Stevens. I'm Vice Dean in the Faculty of Science and Professor in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. And on behalf of the faculty, I'd like to welcome you to the 14th CERN and Science session, which is part of our Soup and Science series, which gives professors in the faculty and indeed students sometimes the opportunity to showcase their research in a short lecture environment. So we've got three great speakers today who will be presenting their research. We've got Professor Grant McKenzie from the Department of Geography. We've got Professor Laura Pollock from the Department of Biology. And then Professor Siva Reddy from the School of Computer Science and Department of Linguistics. So the presentations will run for about 5 minutes. And then when all of the presentations are completed, everyone will receive a message from the host, Preeti, to join a breakout room. In the breakout room, there'll be smaller groups of participants, and the three professors will be rotating through the rooms over a course of about a 10-minute period to answer your questions if you have any. So when the three breakout rooms are completed, everybody will head back to the central room for final remarks. So we'll begin today with Grant, Professor McKenzie from Department of Geography. Thanks, Grant.
Great, thank you. Let me just make sure that I'm back here. Perfect, so thank you very much for coming to this and listening to what we're having to say here. I got a quick 5 minutes to do this. I always forget how short this is. So a quick subject of my talk today is about COVID-19, something we're probably all very tired of hearing about, but something I think it's important to do some research on and look in this case at comparing countries, how countries have responded in terms of mobility response or activity response. I'm in the Department of Geography and I lead the Palatial Analysis Lab there. So there's our website and links. Just a quick sort of background on this, as we're realizing, as we quickly realized that COVID-19 was a global pandemic, most national governments started to enact policies that really restricted the activities that were conducted by the inhabitants and visitors to these countries, right? So that means that schools and businesses were closed, public events, transit, all these things were affected. And that actually decreased the mobility and activities of individuals that lived and were working in these countries. And so this was true for, countries around the world. And so one of the questions that we were quite interested in was, are there differences in how the mobility actually changed between countries, right? The decrease in mobility or the activity patterns, as we call them, between countries. And what was that relationship between government enacted policies, so what the government actually indicated they were going to do, and the actual change in mobility or the activity patterns of the inhabitants of these countries. Just to give you a quick chart, this is a dashboard we put together. There's a million dashboards out there, but this is ingesting the Google data. So Google actually released mobility patterns or change from baseline of mobility patterns. So for those of you that have a cell phone that use Google, pretty much Google anything, Google Maps, you've agreed to the terms and conditions to use your data anonymously, and they actually track everywhere you go in a lot of cases, again, anonymously. But this is showing us over time for Canada, what the mobility patterns have looked like. So for retail and recreation, residential, parks, grocery stores, these sorts of things. And what you can see is in mid-March in Canada, you saw this sort of drastic decrease in mobility. In the case of residential, it went up. And then over time, this is actually taking us through sort of middle of July, we see parks increase there as well. So we have a dashboard showing all this information for countries around the world. You can compare provinces, these sorts of things as well. But we were really interested in seeing what that decrease in mobility right around the sort of March, April timeframe looked like for all the different countries and how that compared to government response. What we mean by government response in this case was basically government policy response. So there's some excellent research that came out of the University of Oxford that developed what we call a stringency index, which took 13 different indicators of government response. This was how quickly schools were closed, if they were closed locally, globally, or sort of nationally, I mean, what it meant for businesses being closed, how much money got put into healthcare, all these sorts of things were calculated in this stringency index. It was calculated daily for a bunch of almost 150 countries. And what we actually were able to look at, if you look at on the right there, this is an example from the country of Oman, the stringency index is the black line. going up, so the increase in restrictions based on policy, and then you have that compared to the decrease in mobility as reported by Google community mobility patterns. And so if we invert one of those, we can actually calculate the correlation between these different lines, right? So how well did people respond compared to the restrictions put on by the government? And then also, what does that look like in terms of lag time? So if government enacted some policies, was there a lag between when the policies were enacted and when people actually responded to the activity pattern, through their activity patterns, their movement within a city or country? Just to give you a few different examples of what that looks like, I just pulled out 4 countries from our analysis here. The top left one is New Zealand. You've probably heard a lot about New Zealand if you've been following the news in terms of their response. They were one of the better responses of most countries in terms of the policies that were put in place happened quite drastically and dramatically, but also the response from the citizens and people living in the countries was quite high as well. So what we found is that as one of the highest correlations of all the different countries. And compare that to Sweden. Sweden had, arguably a less good response in that case. So their highest stringency index was about 50 out of a possible 100. And we saw the same thing happen for mobility response. It wasn't nearly as drastic as we saw in New Zealand. In response to lag time, South Africa was the country that had one of the lowest or highest lag time responses. It was just over a week and a half in terms of when the policies were enacted by the government and when people actually responded in terms of their mobility patterns. And then you have another country I threw in here, Egypt, which was interesting because they actually had a pretty good, there was not much lag, except we had an instance where there was a major storm that happened right at the beginning of COVID that impacted our model here as well. So the last slide here I just wanted to talk about, very quickly going through this. We also compared our correlation and lag values assessment measures with different global indices. So we looked at things like UN Development Index, World Bank Development Index as well, and gross domestic product, life expectancy, and infant mortality rate, not that surprisingly correlated with these lag response times that we saw. Surprising for me was that things like trust in government, corruption index, and press freedom didn't actually correlate at all with any of these things. Some of our ongoing future work this is really only focused at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. We now have 4 more months of data to actually compare with some of these to see what the response has been. Will there be a second wave, and what does that look like for responses, and what are some additional policy measures and indices we can compare this to? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. So our second speaker then today is Professor Laura Pollock from the Department of Biology.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. So thank you everyone for taking some time out of your summer to listen to some research, and that was a fascinating first talk by Grant. I actually have some questions for you later. So to follow the talk about COVID, I'm just going to briefly give you an overview of the sort of things that we do in my lab. So I run the Quantitative Biodiversity Lab in the Department of Biology. Let me see if I can change the slide here. Here we go. So there's the website there if you want to go and see some of the projects that we're currently working on. So in the midst of all of this pandemic and everything, we don't want to forget about the other things that we still should be caring about. And I think biodiversity is one of those things. And so, why do we care about biodiversity? And I've put these graphs on. These are fake graphs. These were just made by me. So we've seen all of these graphs before. So we know that the climate is changing, and we know that biodiversity is suffering as a result of the climate and a number of other things, of fragmentation, of land use change, and so we know that the climate is going up, and we know that biodiversity is going down, but we don't know a lot about this. We know that it's declining, but we aren't really certain about what groups it's declining in. But there was recently an assessment, and there was an estimate that 1 million species are at risk of extinction. And so that's a huge number of species. And it's way more species than we can invest conservation resources towards protecting. And so we have to make some decisions. And so basically what happens now is we protect the species that we've chosen to protect. Often these are the cute, cuddly species. These are the species that someone has taken an interest in. which is great. We need to have that conservation. But at the same time, if 1 million species are threatened with extinction, we need to think about what other species we might be interested in protecting. And there's a lot of good reasons to do that. There might be species that help us persist as humans. There might be species that hold some, molecular compounds that we can use in pharmaceutical drugs. There might be some species that are crucial for maintaining ecosystems. And so what my research tries to do is take a broad look at all of this diversity to see if we can narrow down which species should we be protecting. And we have a whole lot of new information that we can draw on to do that. And so this is an example of some new information. So this is a phylogeny. So it's on the left is a phylogeny of all bird species. So for over 9,000 species of birds around the world. So the species are around the outside here, and the colors, so the branches represent the evolutionary patterns, the evolutionary ancestry of those species. And the colors of the branches here are just the rate of evolution. So you can see that some groups have evolved very rapidly, some groups are older, but they hold a lot of evolutionary diversity. And so there are different reasons that we should care about those different species. And the other thing that I do is we try to integrate species interactions into this analysis. And so species interactions, even though we know from 100 years of ecology, they're very important, but they're almost always ignored in conservation. And so again, how can we sort of draw from this new information to help inform our conservation? And one of the first questions we have, because we do not know this for most species in the world, we don't really know where they are. So it's sort of the basic amount of information that we would want to know. And so a lot of my research is creating statistical models. So using all of that data input, creating a statistical model and making a prediction of where that species is, of where different communities are, and how they will change with climate change and other stressors. Oh, whoops. Go back one. There we go. And so it's sort of a combination. A lot of what I do is now coding on a computer. So bringing in these big data sources. This is an example of a food web that we have for Europe. And so this is a condensed version of it, but it's information that we've drawn from the literature and asking experts of which species each eats which other species. So it's over 1,000 species. It's 70,000 different interactions of species. And then we can sort of start to understand what are the parts of this network? What is the structure of this network? Which species are really tightly interacting and which others are not? And then we combine that with the spatial analysis to sort of model interactions across space. And occasionally, not often anymore, but occasionally we do go into the field as well. And so we use this information to validate the models that we make. And the other part of it is answering these more applied questions. And so there's a big movement right now to set global conservation goals. So this is where in the entire world that we should put our conservation resources, given that they're so limited, we have so few resources. And so we use all of these big layers that we create with the models to then help conservation decision makers decide where should we protect. So this is an example of an analysis with the birds, the phylogeny that I showed you before. So 9,000 bird species. And if you look on the left, this is a phylogeny of those bird species. And the branches are color-coded based on threat to those species or to those lineages. And so this is the key. So anything that's black or dark red is less than 10% of the distribution of that species or that branch that's protected. And then we can run an optimization to say, well, if we were to protect just slightly more than we're protecting now, so if we were to increase things that, the amount protected as to some global target, and then these algorithms are really efficient, and then we can see, well, how much more could we protect? And so the graph on the right is that same phylogeny, but now the branches are color-coded with what could be protected in this sort of hypothetical reserve system. And so you can see here, almost all of them are above that 10% threshold. that we care about. So basically, if you would expand global protected areas by 5%, you could protect triple the amount of biodiversity in total. And this is an example for birds, but that's the case for a lot of different groups that we've tried. And so you can see, so I work with Map of Life, and we're trying to put these visualizations so you can actually go to this website and choose, different areas and look at the sort of conservation solution for these areas. And so that's it in a nutshell, and I look forward to the discussions afterward.
Thank you very much, Laura. So the final speaker today then is Professor Siva Reddy from School of Computer Science. He's jointly appointed in the Department of Linguistics in the Faculty of Arts.
Thanks, David. Thanks for these excellent talks. It's so much to learn. I'm really glad I made it to this session. Okay, so this session is a bit different from the other two talks. It has not much to do with biology or geography. So this is about building computers that understand and interact in human language. So why should we care about language understanding using computers is, I can skip this because, okay. Yeah, we know that human language is a distinctive characteristic of human species. If you take evolution, compared to other animals, I think humans have much more sophisticated language mechanism. So that tells you something about intelligence. So if we are going to build really intelligent systems, one of the prerequisites we think is building intelligent missions that can understand human language. Okay, that's mainly on the theoretical motivation, but on the practical motivation, we know that these computers that interact in language have a lot of applications. So, for example, almost everybody in the world speak language, but not many of these people are educated enough to use computers. So, if we can enable language interfaces to computers, these people can make use of this technology or information on the web and get their tasks accomplished. For example, millions of people in India, for example. And also we saw latest technology like Alexa or Google Home, where your children keep interacting with these machines in natural language. There's so much to learn from these interactions. So my goal is to make these interactions more natural and enable these machines to understand language. Okay, so for people who are not that familiar with language interfaces to machines, so Google search is one of those language interfaces. So if you ask Google how many people live in India, it would directly give you an answer. So it says in 2017, it's 1.3 billion. Okay. This is great. Whatever we have accomplished so far, it's immensely useful. And this is how people like Google or companies like Google are in our research. This is how we implement. So when somebody produces an utterance, a natural language utterance, we take a machine learning model and convert that utterance into a machine representation. And we know that machines understand code like C++, Java, or SQL. Recently, there have been other kinds of representations called deep neural representations. So that's also some kind of machine representation. So we produce from language this representation that machine can understand. And once it executes this machine representation, it could give you the answer. So in this case, people have curated a lot of world facts in databases like Freebase, Wikidata. And if you execute this particular query on this database, you get the answer. So the task of language understanding becomes, given a language, how can we convert it into some representation which machine understands, and take that representation and execute to get the results what we want. Okay, this is great, but the biggest problem with the human language is it's very complex. We know that language is compositional, which means that you could build a really long sentence, or most of my sentences that I spoke today, you probably would never find them on internet. So language is very generative. So in this case, the same question, what was the population of India, I just added what was the population of the capital of India, just introducing one little thing in between, and the semantics completely changes, right? If you ask this question, this is the answer given by Google. So it again says population of India is again, like, instead of giving the population of capital of India, which is Delhi, it still gives the population of India. So it has a difficulty understanding this compositional language. And it's not just language is compositional, language is also conversational. So these machines have to understand what you have talked about. So in this case, this is your Google Assistant, which is telling you that, hey, I can let you know if you need a jacket today. That's the conversation history. And as a user, you say, hey, do I need it, or something like that? And the machine immediately says, sorry, I don't understand. It forgot that it's talking about this rain and jacket. So modeling conversational language is really hard. Okay? And the other thing is, most of current research is focused so much on English, but there are close to maybe like 5,000, 6,000 languages easily. And if you see for those languages, this is my mother tongue called Telugu, and the same query, how many people live in India, the Google gives results as how many Americans live in India, instead of giving how many people live in India. Excuse me. And also it says, why does India and China have so many people? It doesn't actually answer the question. It gives something else. And one of the recent findings of my research is that when you build these machine learning models, they learn from real world data. So in this case, let's say the context is, he is an Arab from Middle East. Because the model has learned from real world data, and we know that there are stereotypes in the world. When you ask this question, it's likely that the model will say one of these options, and most likely it will pick option 1. So it's going to say he's probably a terrorist with bombs, because it has learned that Middle East is associated with some kind of terrorists, which is wrong. We don't want machines to do this, especially language interfaces. And it's unlikely to pick he's a pacifist, and it's unlikely to say my dog wants a walk, because these models do understand context, what is relevant in this context, but they magnify the stereotypes that are present in this society. Okay. So my research is on building robust models of language understanding with theoretical foundations from linguistics and from machine learning. So on the linguistic side, I do things like how can we represent meaning? What does a sentence mean? What is the structure of a sentence? So that's on the linguistic side. On the machine learning side, I convert this, I have some supervised data, some data given, some language input given, some actions that are associated with the language. So I try to learn a function that automatically maps language to the target representation. So that's on the machine learning side. And I'm also trying to see if I can contribute from machine learning side to linguistics and from linguistics to machine learning side.